Hello, and welcome to this webinar on practical steps to buying goods and services safely, what to check, and how to check it. My name is Alan Bryce. I'm the Business Fraud Campaign Manager at the Fraud Advisory Panel, and I'm the chair for today's webinar. This webinar is presented as part of our national campaign called Love Business, Hate Fraud, to raise awareness of fraud and cybercrime against UK businesses, especially small ones. We encourage you to share this webinar and any of our other Love Business, Hate Fraud resources with your colleagues. If you're joining us live, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Questions can be submitted at any time using the Q&A box on your screen. We'll strive to answer as many of those as we can towards the end of this session. We have three excellent speakers today. First, Laura Hoff, the Associate Director with the accountancy firm BDO's International Institutions and Donor Assurance Department. Laura is a chartered accountant and a certified fraud examiner and leads the department's work around anti-corruption and fraud prevention. Laura has worked for 15 years in the arena of counter-fraud and financial crime, with experience spanning the private sector, the Financial Conduct Authority, international not-for-profits, and the public sector. Prior to joining BDO, Laura led a review into fraud and corruption risks in local government procurement. Christoph Fleiger is a senior manager within BDO's corporate intelligence team, where he manages a team handling complex due diligence, tax, and fraud investigations, and asset tracing work. Christoph specializes in Middle East, Africa, and the Asian regions. Before joining BDO, Christoph ran his own consultancy, where he's involved in over 150 cases across 40 countries. Christoph has an MBA and a master's degree in law. And Joanna Kozlowska. Joanna is an assistant manager within BDO's corporate intelligence team, where she handles complex due diligence, investigations, and asset tracing work. Joanna specializes in Russian, Spanish, and Portuguese-speaking countries and regions. Before joining BDO, Joanna was a senior researcher at the global business intelligence consultancy, Kroll. There she provided advice on high-risk transactions to clients across banking, private sector, healthcare, and hospitality sectors, among others. Joanna has a master's degree in politics and international relations from the University of Cambridge. Over to you, Laura.
Great, so hopefully you can see my slides there now. So during this first section of the webinar today, I'm just going to provide an introduction to the topic, as well as providing an overview of how fraud might happen within the procurement lifecycle. So when you're buying goods and services, what kind of red flags of fraud you can look out for, and a few of the steps you can take in order to protect your organization from those risks when buying goods and services. So first of all then, what do we mean when we're talking about procurement fraud? Essentially, this is fraud in buying goods, works or services for your organization. So I've included here on the screen a couple of definitions. So one of them is from Action Fraud and one of them from the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. So you'll see from these two definitions that the procurement fraud can happen at any stage in this life cycle that you can see on the bottom left of the screen there. It could happen during the tendering process, it could happen during the contract delivery, so at any stage during that cycle. The amounts involved could be large or they could be small. So we might see something like the manipulation of the award of a large contract of a very high value. Or it could also be concerned with overcharging on low value items during the contract delivery, for example. These kind of frauds can involve people within or external to your organization. So someone that works for you, maybe someone who's a supplier of yours, but it could also involve collusion between one or more parties, whether that's across internal and external, or purely internal staff members colluding with one another. So to provide then a little bit more detail about how these risks can occur across this life cycle, I've just put up a few examples on the screen here. So at the planning stage, it might be that unnecessary items are included in those plans, perhaps to ensure that a particular supplier actually receives some work from your organization when it ought not to. Maybe there's a connection with that supplier and one of your staff members, or maybe it's in exchange for a kickback or some other kind of reward. When assessing the needs of your organization, these could be manipulated again to ensure that a certain supplier receives work, perhaps in exchange again for kickbacks, or perhaps there's a connection there or some kind of quid pro quo situation going on. But again, this could lead to purchases taking place that your organization doesn't really need. When we get to the tendering phase, you might see collusion between suppliers through price fixing or bid rotation amongst themselves, so sharing out the market so that only one of them gets a certain tender at one time and later on it will go to another person. So then once you've received in those tenders and quotations, you're down to choosing a winner who is going to be awarded that contract. And at this stage, you might see some manipulation of the scoring to ensure that certain suppliers win that contract and are awarded that contract. So this could be for the same sort of reasons, either a personal advantage or a kickback, or because there's a connection with a certain supplier, some kind of benefit going back and forth. Next, we move to the stage of awarding the contract. And at this point, it might be that the contract is amended to the benefit of the supplier. Perhaps there's an uptick in the fees that they receive, and they're awarded slightly larger fees for particular jobs than they should have been. So to the benefit of the supplier, but then also likely to the benefit of somebody who's involved in awarding that contract from your organization, so a kickback or another benefit. And finally, we move on to the stage of the management of the contract itself. At this stage, you might see some deliberate overcharging on behalf of a supplier, or maybe substituting products of a lower quality or value rather than those that you've actually paid for. You could also see collusion between staff and suppliers at this stage, agreeing to share that overcharged amount between themselves if you have that issue at this point. So frauds can creep in there as well. So this is quite theoretical so far. And I wanted to really cover some examples of where we see procurement fraud and fraud in purchasing and goods and services sort of in real life, as it were. So I've just selected a few examples here of cases really that we see in the news. So obviously this is a large figure here, 1.5 million in bribes, but this happened at Coca-Cola. So an individual in his role as an electrical and automation manager took bribes of 1.5 million pounds in exchange for selling confidential information to ensure that the favoured bidder won the contract. So in this case, we see the collusion between the two, the internal and the external, in exchange for that bribe for the individual internally. Next here, I've got the potato fraud. So two directors at a potato supplying company to Sainsbury's were providing the potato buyer within the supermarket with gifts and hospitality, so effectively bribing this individual in exchange for the award of those contracts. So, we see in that delivery phase, we're overcharging by nearly £9 million in that case. So these are big figures. We've also got an example of purely external procurement fraud. So 5 fit-out firms got together to engage in a process called cover bidding for competitive tenders. So they agreed with each other how they were going to place their bids to ensure that only one of them would be sort of in the running for the contract. So they placed their prices lower to ensure that only one of them would win. But they were actually found out and then fined £7 million for this bid rigging they'd undertaken. We also see an example here where procurement fraud has impacted a local council. So in this case, a businessman set up a company in his wife's name and used it to overcharge the council's highway department. So for a large number of very low value items in this case. This was in collusion with the stores controller within the council, who placed orders deliberately with this company so that they could share the proceeds out between themselves. So we see collusion at a large scale there as well. And the last example I've got here is to do with honey and product substitution, essentially. So the honey is being watered down with sugar syrup, but still being sold at full price, for high quality honey. So that's where we see, a product substitution scam coming into play as well at that stage. But what should you be looking out for in your organization? We've seen a few of the risks in theory, and we've seen how they materialize in reality with those examples I just showed you. But what can you look out for and what can you be aware of when you're going about your purchasing of goods and services? So here we have some red flags. And when we talk about red flags, we should be aware that these are just indicators that something might be going wrong. Without looking into them further and asking more questions, we can't be sure that they are indicative of fraud. They may be another explanation, but still very good to be aware of. So first of all, a key one can be customer complaints. Maybe this indicates non-delivery of services that they were expecting, or maybe they're complaining about those poor quality items, which links back to our product substitution example previously. Maybe you observe some sort of cozy relationships between staff and suppliers that aren't usually there, and that makes you ask a question. Perhaps suppliers are giving one of your staff members some very generous gifts and hospitality, and that could lead to you asking why. Maybe that's a form of a bribe in exchange for some kind of contract. Maybe when you look at the spend with suppliers month on month, some of them seem unusually high or perhaps unusually low. And there might be a reason for this. Maybe suppliers have been overcharging. Maybe somebody has deliberately removed the business from one supplier to another because they get some kind of personal benefit from using supplier A rather than supplier B. You might also notice that there have been a lot of stock and asset write-offs, for example. So this could be indicative of assets and stock being stolen, maybe sold on, and then written off from your books and records. So that's worth examining as well. We sometimes see that orders to particular suppliers are split into many smaller orders so that they always fall below the thresholds for that additional level of scrutiny. So this bid splitting can be indicative of somebody trying to keep something below the radar and to give business to perhaps an organisation that doesn't deserve it or that gives them a reward in exchange. You might also see that the same supplier is frequently winning the tenders, so all of them, in a market you might expect to be more vibrant and more competitive. So then you also need to ask a question of why that's happening. And similarly, if there's only one credible supplier submitting a bid in a market you'd expect to have lots of options, this could indicate some kind of collusion and bid rigging amongst the suppliers themselves. So that's worth considering as well. Finally then, I just wanted to leave you with a few ideas and suggestions of how you can keep your organisation safe from these risks of fraud when purchasing goods and services. So on the one hand, things I recommend that you do would be to conduct due diligence on your suppliers, find out who you're working with, think about if they're the right fit for you, are they who they really say they are? But you'll hear lots more about that from my colleagues Christoph and Joanna shortly. Check your employee references. Make sure you're only working with people and letting people into your organisation that you want to have there, and who they say they are with the qualifications they say they've got. Take the time to just monitor the spend you have with your suppliers in whatever form is suitable to the size of your organisation. We often talk about segregation of duties, and this can be very, very key, in the payments process and the procurement process, but also when thinking about decision making. Is that segregated in the appropriate separation between the different roles within those functions? It's also worth monitoring your inventory and assets, having a good system for checking that everything's where it should be, and ensuring that you have written policies and procedures in place for payments, for procurement, and that these are updated as things change. A lot of us have moved to working from home now, and how has that changed how we operate? It's great to have those things written down. And also I'd advise to make the best use of your contracts. Can you put clauses in there about anti-corruption and counter-fraud? Do you ensure your milestones are in there, the payment terms are clear, etc.? So just make sure you check in with your legal advisors and get the best use out of your contracts that you can. On the side of things that we should try and avoid if we're trying to prevent procurement fraud, would be don't allow one person to make all the decisions. So they can decide to give the business to their friends, or they can decide to give it always to the same supplier. Similarly, don't allow one person to perform all the payment activities, because they can then manipulate those payments and potentially send them where they shouldn't be going. Make sure you have a good process for accepting deliveries, so that you don't accept deliveries that don't match those specifications. So protecting yourself from product substitution. And don't take on new employees or volunteers or contractors without checking out their references. So you're really protecting your organisation from those risks as much as you can. Great, thank you all very much for listening, and I'm just going to pass you over to Christoph and Joanna now for their section.
Thank you very much, Laura. Yeah, as Laura mentioned in a previous slide, one of the best ways to protect yourself against fraud is, in fact, to know as much as you can on your supplier, as to practice due diligence. That means basically just getting as much information that you can, so you get a proper understanding on who you are transacting with. And so the objective of our presentation is going to show you what, give you a set of tools basically, where you can gather information on a company and run some basic checks to help you have a better understanding on your company, on your supplier's standing. The tools we are going to talk about, they're all available for free. They're all easy to use. They're all in English, so there is no complex maneuverings. There is nothing to learn really about. And the other thing is, what we're going to show you is not only what these tools are. We are going to show you as well what the best way to get relevant information out of them, because it's not just a question of putting a name through and then getting a long list of records and transactions, and you don't know if it applies to you or not. So we're going to help to show you what the best way to build queries that trigger relevant information back. And finally, the other thing is, what we are going to try to do is to show what do you do with this information, because as I mentioned before, like even if you see something that is alarming to you, it might have a very good explanation. So like it's more how to build a picture around the information you find, and the way we're going to do that is we have a deck of slide here available, but we thought the best way to do that is to go through a live case study. So you will be using all the sites that mentioned on the site. We are all going to use them. We are going to do the query in front of you, so you see exactly how that works. And finally, I wanted to mention there is the slides and as well all the website links, all the way to set up queries and everything will be available into a handout that will be downloadable from the FAPS website. So like you don't need to take note, just enjoy the presentation, and we'll have it all the information available for you, like for you. And now I'm going to hand you over to Joanna, who is going to run through like a quick overview of all the tools we plan to use.
Thank you, Christoph. So before I walk you through our plan for the presentation, I just wanted to say very quickly, all the tools that Christoph has mentioned are actually tools that we within BDO, within the corporate intelligence team, we use the very same tool, at least at the initial stage of our investigations into the reputation of a particular company or a particular individual. And also, as Christoph mentioned, all of them are publicly available in English and free of charge. So what are we going to talk about today? First of all, we're going to show you how to find key details about a company you're thinking about going into business with. That means its registration details, details of the key people behind the company, as well as the most important financials. Second of all, we're going to show you how to check a potential supplier's VAT registration, whether they're registered for VAT, whether the VAT number is all in order. This is really to help you make sure, first of all, that the supplier is who they say they are, and second of all, that they are not likely to get into trouble with the tax authorities further down the road, because that might lead them to not be able to meet their obligations to you. And thirdly, we are going to show you how to search the internet for negative information, or potential negative information that might be out there about your potential supplier, and how to, refine and target your searches to get the fullest results in the least possible time. So the sources we're going to walk you through are Companies House, the UK Corporate Registry, that speaks directly to point one, key registration details, details about the key financials, the key people. Second of all, VAT number verification services for both the UK and the EU. That speaks to point two, of course, and then when it comes to point three, we are going to show you, first of all, really how to make the most of Google searches, because you might be surprised just how much a simple Google, well, maybe it's like not so simple, but still a very, very easy to perform Google search might yield very quickly and without any undue effort on your part. And then finally, we are just going to very quickly walk you through the main legal, regulatory and licensing databases available for the UK that will let you verify suppliers' track records or just clarify any information that you have found that might worry you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. So yeah, the first thing we're going to look at is Companies House. And we are going to go directly into the website. So you see basically what it looks like for you, for some of you who haven't already been there. And as well, I'm going just to point out the key information you want to have a good look at to assess like I guess how dangerous or not it might be to deal with one of the suppliers. So Joanna is going to show you how to basically just access the website.
I'm sorry, can you see the Companies House page already?
We are on
it. We click on Find Company Information, scroll down, click on Start Now. So in terms of VAT, first of all, so VAT, as you know, the value-added tax on goods and services, used in more than 140 countries around the world. But then that doesn't necessarily mean that every company has to register for and pay VAT. In the UK, any limited company whose turnover over the past year is greater than £85,000 needs to register for and pay VAT. This doesn't mean that businesses not exceeding this threshold can't register voluntarily. Many do it because maybe in the early stages of running a business, registering for VAT might maybe confer a certain additional respectability, maybe bolster your reputation. So many businesses do choose to register even though they don't technically have to register. Of course, if you are dealing with a small or recently founded business, they might not have to register and might have chosen not to, which isn't necessarily a red flag. You might have noticed a thread running through this whole presentation. All of this information isn't necessarily black and white. Very often it's really a case of considering whether what your suppliers have told you about themselves, about the scale of their operation, about the revenue, about the financial situation and market share overall is consistent with what you see in Companies House or what you see in these other open sources. But anyway, do check the financial filings of the company. Christoph has to show you how to do that. See whether their revenue means that they will have to register for VAT. And then if you find that they do, or if it's not clear, as might be the case, we're going to show you an example in a little bit. But if you think they might be registered for VAT, there's a very easy way to find their VAT number. This will normally be provided on any invoice submitted to you or another official document, such as an insurance form or claim. And larger companies, such as BDO, that we both, or all three of us work for, might also list their VAT number on their website. If this is not the case, and if you have not yet received any official documents from the supplier, you can also use an online VAT number search engine. What if you can't verify a supplier's VAT number? Well, if you're unable to verify the details of the supplier who claims they are registered for VAT, might have given you a number, but this number just does not check out, it might essentially mean that they are not who they say they are. So think very carefully before sending any payments or submitting any sensitive documents. Alternatively, if we have a supplier who is liable for VAT but hasn't registered, they might face hefty fines down the road, which may cause them to file for bankruptcy. And even if it doesn't, they might be unable to meet their obligations to you. So that's definitely something to watch out for. And yes, moving on to negative information. There are essentially two broad areas here which we need to talk about. The first of them is browser searches, and you might really be surprised how much information you might gain from a quick Google search. The other, which Christoph is going to talk you through very quickly at the end, are legal and regulatory information databases available for the UK, as well as the registers of licensing bodies if you're dealing with a professional who claims to be licensed, whether that's an accountant, a financial professional, a doctor, etc.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I'm going to literally just mention them quickly. If you didn't find anything, there's another very, very useful website, which is called BEI. Information will be on the handout, where basically it's a database that aggregate most of the court cases that took place in the UK. So like if you wouldn't have found the article you just found, allegedly he was accused of fraud, was he found guilty or not, you might want to go to BEI and see if there's a court case that tells you what decision was reached on that case. Final point is some services, as you all know, are regulated. So like if you use the services of a financial advisor, of an accountant or whatever, make sure he has the relevant licenses that is registered with the financial authority or with the accounting body or the medical bodies it belongs to. We have provided in the handout a list of the main website to hit depending on the sector of activity. And as well, there are two last one I want to mention, which is the register of disqualified director. You might want to see if your supplier is listed there, or on the individual insolvency register. And finally, before I hand it back to Alan, is just to say, look, these are all just points that build the picture. Every single one of these points can have a good explanation, but it helps to give you a good idea, or at least the beginning of a good idea. And the idea is then you can go and talk to your supplier and ask more informed questions. That's it from us. Thank you very much for your time. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Christoph, and to Joanna there. Just a quick reminder, we're about to do run through some questions. If you would like to ask any questions, please put them on the Q&A box on the screen. If you go into the Q&A box on the screen, and we'll take as many as we are able to in the time we have remaining. I'll just say before we go into the questions, for someone who's worked in county for us for such a long time, and have heard time and again the issue in terms of procurement fraud is undertake due diligence checks. It's really encouraging to see firsthand what those checks can be, what's freely available, and again available to all, not just small businesses, but for all organizations of all sizes, to help undertake the sort of checks that you probably should be doing in advance in relation to addressing any procurement risks you might have. So as I say, if you do have any questions, please go to the Q&A box. In the time we have available though, and I'd just like to use the chair's discretion here, I'd like to ask our three speakers in turn, perhaps starting with yourself, Laura, if you have a top tip for people on this call, on the webinar, in terms of understanding the best advice you'd give to particularly a smaller organization in relation to addressing this issue of procurement risk.
Thanks, Alan. That's great to hear from my colleagues there. That was really, really interesting. From my point of view, I think it's all about just taking that time to stop and think. You know, does the invoice that just came across your desk look normal? You'll know best in your organization what that kind of normal looks like, how much you should be spending, what kind of suppliers you work with. So I think it's just to sort of take that time and trust yourself. If you think something doesn't look quite right, it's worth checking and following up on. That's my top piece of advice, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. And again, for both Joanne and Christoph, perhaps Christoph first, if you're available, what would your top tip be to those listening in the webinar?
So I think for me, the key thing is once you have done the checks and you're happy, after a certain period of time, especially if your supplier plays a key part in your day-to-day business, review them on a regular basis. Don't just do it before you start a relationship. do them as well 2 years down the line and regularly that way, because the picture might change, and it's always better to know beforehand and ask the right question than be badly surprised at the end of the process. That's it, really.
Thanks, Christophe. I think that's a really good point. It's not just one-time checks that you should be undertaking. It's considering those issues and risk on an ongoing basis. And finally, with yourself, Joanna, what would you advise as the top tip?
Well, following on from both Laura and Christophe's points, I would say talk to your supplier. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Like we said before, none of the information you will find in these online sources is necessarily black and white. They might point to specific areas of concern, but there may very well be a good explanation for many of the things you can find. So definitely talk to your supplier, listen carefully to the responses they give you, and maybe also think about the manner in which they are responding to you. If they, for example, get defensive on learning that you have been doing due diligence checks on them, if they move to or shut down the conversation, if they in turn start asking you suspicious questions, that in itself is a big red flag. So definitely talk to your supplier and think carefully about how they respond.
Great, and thank you, Joanna. So there we have our top tips from our three speakers. Just as a reminder that we're going to include a PDF sheet that will have a list of the useful websites that we've been talking about in relation to addressing these procurement risks, and that will be made freely available. And in addition, if you would like to contact and speak to Laura, Joanna, or Christophe more directly, please just go through ourselves here at the Fraud Advisory Panel team, and we'll be happy to make those introductions. Thus, in concluding this webinar, I'd first like to thank our guest speakers, so Laura, Christophe, Joanna, and thank you for listening. This webinar will be available shortly on demand from our website, www.lovebusinesshatefraud.org.uk, where you'll find the other useful resources that we have available in relation to supporting the campaign Love Business Hate Fraud. And please, we encourage you to use them as you think is most appropriate and helpful for your business. Before you leave this webinar, can I ask please that you complete the short survey, which will pop up on screen in just a moment. There are only 5 questions and should only take about a minute to complete, but will be really invaluable in terms of assisting us plan any future webinars. Just a quick reminder for your diary, our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 27th of October, this time starting at 6 p.m. on the subject of staff fraud. If you're a small or medium-sized business or organization and have always wanted to know more about the checks that you should be running on staff throughout the employment cycle, then please join us on the 27th of October and listen to insider fraud experts talk us through the simple, practical steps that you can take. And finally, our previous webinar, Why Tackling Fraud Makes Good Business Sense, is also available on demand now from our Love Business Hate Fraud website. So thank you and goodbye.